Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today's question is this month's patron pick. Thank you so much to all of my wonderful supporters on Patreon. Somewhat unusually, the topic that was chosen this month was actually a normal rules and policy question, just like what I usually do on the channel. Well, if you saw the thumbnail, maybe not exactly what you normally see here. Amy controls a Laboratory Maniac, which lets her win the game instead of losing if she tries to draw from an empty library, and a Future Sight, which lets her look at and play the top card of her library. She only has one card left in her library, something expensive that she definitely won't be able to make enough mana to cast. But Amy has a plan to win the game. She says that she's casting this spell from the top of her library, which, if you're a longtime fan of the channel, you know the first step of doing that would be to move it onto the stack. Later, in the process of casting a spell, you calculate the cost to cast it, then you have a chance to activate mana abilities, and then you pay that cost. Well, you know what officially counts as a mana ability? The Parlay ability on Selvala Explorer Returned. Even though it might not generate any mana at all and does a bunch of other wacky stuff, it still meets the official definition for a mana ability given in the CR. So Amy activates that, maybe generating some amount of mana, but more importantly, having all players draw a card. Since Amy has moved the one card in her library onto the stack as the first step in casting the spell, her library is empty, meaning that Laboratory Maniac will replace her draw with her winning the game. And so, Amy has won the game by performing an illegal action. Yay? So anyway, that's the setup. Go ahead and leave a like and a subscribe if you appreciate how I didn't drag that out for 10 minutes and make you watch a part 2 for my analysis. Although, I must say, the analysis here is a little bit unsatisfying. I guess the ultimate question is whether this is allowed, and if not, what would be the appropriate infraction, penalty, and fix? On the one hand, everything Amy did was according to the processes described in the comprehensive rules. On the other hand, this play relies on her starting to perform some game action with the full knowledge that she would not be able to legally complete it. Now, as a judge, the process that I use when analyzing real-life calls starts with identifying what infraction, if any, the player has committed. So let's start there. To determine the infraction, we'll need to look at the first thing Amy did that was against the rules. And to put it frankly, I'm not sure what that would be. Moving her expensive spell to the stack? Well, no, that's literally the first step in casting a spell. Many commenters in online discussions of this scenario opined that it could count as cheating if Amy took a game action knowing that she wouldn't legally be able to complete it. But if you look in the official definition for cheating given in Magic's IPG, it would say that a player needs to break a rule, which brings us right back to where we started. Unless someone can point to a specific rule that Amy has broken, I'd have to say that this play is completely legitimate. Now that said, if this situation came up in a tournament that I was judging, what I would actually do would be to drive my Maserati to my island full of supermodels, because the only way that this sort of thing would ever happen in a tournament would be in somebody's dream. It's okay that Magic's policy documents don't really have a great answer to this sort of situation because they aren't supposed to be robust enough to handle every possible case, nor even every conceivable case. But anytime you get a really controversial result like this, that is a good opportunity to take a look at your existing systems and see if that weakness revealed any opportunities for improvement. So if we were going to change things, what could we come up with that would make this scenario work out a little bit, well, better? Well, my first thought was changing the definition of mana abilities. In my opinion, this is a really strong start. There's absolutely no reason why Selvala's ability should count as a mana ability. The amount of headaches that it causes being able to effectively cast and resolve what's basically a full spell in the middle of casting another spell just because it technically might add mana is just ridiculous. Chromatic Sphere is bad enough. Now, a lot of the time when people suggest stuff like this, the reason it hasn't been done already is some sort of heap of sororities thing going on, where it's not clear exactly how wacky a mana ability would need to be in order to no longer be considered a mana ability. I mean, Selvala is clearly over the line, but what about Milliken? What about Pristine Talisman? Fortunately, I think there's already a clear line somewhere that gives us a really solid starting point, and that comes from this rule in the CR. Now, in online discussions about this scenario that I saw this rule coming up a lot, but I intentionally avoided talking about it when I was covering how the setup works, because I think it's a red herring. Yes, it's true that if we took the Laboratory Maniac out of the equation, this is the rule that would cover what happens once Amy fails to produce enough mana to cast her big spell. And yes, this rule comes from a section in the CR that's labeled as handling illegal actions, but it's also the case that Laboratory Maniac will end the game before the situation this rule handles ever even comes up. And the text of the rule itself points to a distinction between illegal actions and actions a player starts but cannot legally complete. Now, since Amy is doing something in the original problem statement that clearly fits into the latter category, to me that's strong evidence that it should not be considered part of the former. Now, that being said, the rule stipulates that in either case, the entire action is reversed and any payments already made are canceled. If the action is casting a spell, it's moved back to whatever zone it started in. And here's the part that's relevant to our discussion. Any mana abilities the player legally activated during the play can be reversed. But there's an exception. Players may not reverse actions that moved cards to a library, moved cards from a library to any zone other than the stack, caused a library to be shuffled, or caused cards from a library to be revealed. The nature of these types of actions makes them extra difficult to reverse in a fair way, and so the player is stuck with them. I think this also makes a great list of stuff that could disqualify something from being counted as a mana ability. The problem is that this doesn't really stop the situation from the original problem statement from coming up. I mean, sure, changing the definition for what a mana ability is would stop the specific scenario from the original problem statement, since Selvala's parlay ability would no longer qualify, but unless you had a really hardline interpretation for what counted, you could still have the same sort of issue come up with other cards. For example, with Nefarious Lich out, Pristine Talisman could draw a card. So are we going to say that that shouldn't be a mana ability then? And even if we made it so that only stuff that tapped for mana and did nothing else counted as a mana ability, that doesn't mean WotC couldn't just print a new card someday that would mess it all up. Well, maybe the real problem is that we're not thinking big enough. Why do we even have to have a chance to activate mana abilities during the process of casting a spell at all? Why couldn't we just tap the mana first, and you can only cast a spell if you can fully pay for it before you start? And that's an interesting concept, and actually there was a time in Magic's history when that was how it worked. In 1997, David Mills was the subject of a high-profile disqualification in the finals of the Pro Tour, after committing the infraction of putting a spell on the table before tapping the required mana for it. Well, the backlash was so intense that Wizards actually changed how the rules work such that this wouldn't be an infraction anymore. And ever since then, you officially announce that you're casting the spell first, and then you get a chance to tap mana. But isn't that a little bit outdated? Well, we could go back to making it so that officially you have to tap your mana first. These days, we have a policy on out-of-order sequencing that's probably robust enough to accommodate making it work that way and not letting bad actors get people disqualified by fishing for penalties. So that's not really a concern. There is a pretty compelling gameplay-related reason why we might not want to do that, though. Mana abilities exist as a game concept because they need special handling. For example, they don't use the stack because it would be really gross if Stifle could be cast as a pseudo-force spike by countering the ability of a land to tap for mana. Okay, so maybe we should let them keep that, but the other important property that mana abilities have is that you can activate them anytime something is asking you for a mana payment. Now take that Force Spike, for example. You can activate a mana ability during its resolution because it's asking you to pay 1. Big deal, you say, just tap the lands in response. Then you wouldn't have to tap anything in the middle of the resolution of Force Spike. Well, that's a fair point, but consider that this might not always be a possibility. For example, if you play Bloodbraid Elf while your opponent has a Thalia out, you may or may not need to spend an extra mana to cast whatever you cascade into, depending on whether it's a creature spell or not. If you could not activate mana abilities during the resolution of the cascade ability when you're casting the spell, you would have to guess what your cascade would be and then decide whether or not you wanted to flow mana before seeing what it was. Now, here's another example. Propaganda asks for a mana payment during the Declare Attackers step, but it's during the actual declaration of attackers, which is before players get priority during that step. Because mana drains from players' mana pools whenever the game transitions into a new step, that would make it impossible to attack through a propaganda unless you had something like an Omnath that could keep the mana in your mana pool. I talked about this phenomenon in my video on propaganda plus Deathrite Shaman. So yeah, the way I see it, the rules and policy writers have got this one right. I think it would be nice if we made the definition for mana abilities a little bit more restrictive, but that wouldn't really resolve the issue, just kick the can down the road a little. Any change I could think of that actually really would fix anything would have worse effects for interactions involving cards that actually do see play. So I'm fine with this corner case being the one that ends up with a non-intuitive and unsatisfying answer. That's all I have for you today. Thank you again to all of my lovely supporters on Patreon. Join me again next time for another Daily Ruling, and until then, I hope you have a great day.